Right, welcome to session 10. This session is titled Last But Not Least. And so, bluntly put, this is a session on Paul's ego. In other words, Paul's understanding of himself, what he believed, where he got it from, why he didn't confirm with flesh and blood, and how he saw himself and his ministry. And as I mentioned at the end of the previous session, a lot of how we read Paul's letters, we take it for ourselves. We recontextualize it so that it means when Paul writes, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, we take that to be us. We read it and we say, I, Franz, can do all things. And that is an interpretation. We recontextualizing, we bring it into our context. Okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. But if we want to read Paul for what Paul is saying, we have to understand that he was talking about himself first, at least, and what did not indicate that everyone could do that. So when you read Paul from that more plainer perspective, we get an insight on of who he thought he was, what his ministry was, the pivotal role that his ministry was to play. So nobody really does this better than James Tabor. And as I've explained in some of my other sessions, James does veer from what would be general consensus in one or two points. I don't think this is one. But generally, I really believe I have never really read anyone that explains Paul better than James Tabor. And for me, the study of Paul is a kind of like a full circle. I don't want to talk too much about this now, but I started about 5 years ago, doing this investigation into the Bible canon. Started with the Old Testament, eventually into the New Testament after 3 years. And Paul is the last frontier of the New Testament for me. So it's a kind of a full circle moment and trying to place things into a more logical, realistic framework, trying to get rid of all the dogmatic things that were impressed on me without any investigation. All right, so let's go on to Paul. Now, Paul came after the apostles. When you say the apostles, we mean the 12 that walked with Jesus, right? Yet he believed that he was chosen by God from his birth to reveal a mystery that had not yet been revealed. He called this my gospel. And if you think about it a little bit soberly, this is quite concerning that he would call it my gospel. But it does give you a bit of insight into how he saw himself. He makes mention of other gospels, but then he says, my gospel. If any pastor had to walk on stage this morning on this lovely Sunday morning and said, my gospel, there'd be outcries of heresy and etc. Yet this is exactly what Paul did. He appeared on the scene and said, my gospel. Right, so God chose him to reveal his son to. This is what Paul says in Galatians 1:15-17. And he did not go first to the apostles in Jerusalem to confirm or to check if his notes are correct. He explicitly states this, but he goes to Arabia. What in the world is Paul doing in Arabia? Now, Arabia refers to the desert south of Israel. Now, this is not mentioned in the book of Acts at all, and we've harbored on this point that Acts kind of paints a different picture of Paul, and that we prefer Paul's picture of himself as an early source and a self, at least a first-hand witness to his own life. But in Acts, Paul gets saved in Damascus and goes to Jerusalem right after his Damascus experience, and he meets the apostles there, right? But this is something that Paul actually swears that it is absolutely not the case. It's either that Acts doesn't know about Paul's trip to Arabia, right? That's possible. The other option is he doesn't want to mention it. He wants to link Paul. He wants to harmonize Paul and the apostles. He wants to make it look like Paul had his notes checked by the apostles in Jerusalem, and he purposefully ignores it. And as far as I know, most critical scholars believe that Acts, yes, the writer of Acts, which we assume to be the same writer as Luke, has a agenda here. He is harmonizing Paul with the apostles in Jerusalem. But if we read Paul in isolation, which is a better, earlier, and therefore a more reliable source, and obviously a direct source, we see a different story. All right, so why would Paul have gone to Arabia is the question. What did he do? Where is it? And what's going on? Now, this is not an arbitrary choice. It is in Arabia where we find Sinai, the mountain of God. Now, if you do a bit of study on Sinai, you'd realize that Sinai, where the Church of Sinai is at the moment, I can't remember its name, where they found the Codex Sinaiticus, is not at the very tip of Sinai Peninsula, it's down here, but it's actually more across from Egypt to where Midian and Edom is, more on the right here. So it's just south of Jerusalem. That's most probably where Moses had this experience as it's recorded in scriptures. That's where Elijah had his experience with God. And that this is most probably where Paul goes. He goes into the desert because it seems like he thinks there he will have an experience with God. And there's other evidence which we're going to touch on today to show that that's most probably what's going on. Which makes it all the more curious why Luke Acts would leave this out and actually contradict Paul flat out on this. So what happens here? He headed down there to have his own, possibly to have his own experience with God. And he got this revelation, as he says, directly from the risen Christ and not through or from or by a man. This is Galatians 1 verse 12. Paul does not say how long he stayed there, but he does state that it was 3 years before he goes to Jerusalem. So we have a 3 years missing in Acts of Paul on his own receiving some form of revelation. Then goes up and he says Peter and James, for a very short period, not the others. This is in Galatians 1:18. Later on in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul mentions that he had some form of an ecstatic experience 14 years ago in which he was taken into the heavenly realms and into paradise, seeing and hearing things that were so extraordinary that he was not permitted to reveal them. He uses the third person for irony's sake, but the text in context is him obviously talking about himself. And I'll read it for you, 2 Corinthians 12:2-4. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. We're going to talk about that. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Now, this is a rather serious experience here. Whether in the body or out the body, not sure. But let's take the first option, in the body. Paul believes he ascended into the heavens where God is. Paradise is the highest form of the heavens for that time. And the Ptolemaic cosmos model, it's where God lives. He goes bodily. This is an ascension. That's essentially what we're talking about. If it was out of the body, okay, it's some visionary type of experience, but he's not sure whether it was just visionary or whether this really happened to him. Now, look, this puts Paul on a par with, and above par, with people like Moses and Elijah. You have to understand where this places Paul. This is the highest experience a person can have, to ascend to the very paradise, right? Okay, so the idea of ascending into the third heaven, which is the highest heaven, and gazing upon the glory of God was the highest experience a human can have, akin or better to what Moses and the prophets had. We don't know the precise year in which Paul writes, but it does fall within the general range of his time in Arabia. So it's very possible that these experiences happened to him on the road in Arabia or possibly at the same mountain. We don't know. One should not easily accept Paul's conversion as a one-time event as reported in Acts, right? Paul doesn't make mention of such an event. His visions and revelations from the Lord in 1 Corinthians 12 and 2 Corinthians 12:1 was something he was taught and could have happened to him over a period of time. His abundance of revelations was so extraordinary, that's his own words, that he felt that he could fall victim to pride. Right? So let's reverse that and understand how highly he thought of his experiences. So much so that an angel of Satan was given to him to keep on humbling him. And it was possible that in his mind, what he experienced superseded anything that the other apostles experienced with Jesus. And I want to add, he doesn't, James Tabor doesn't say this, but if you think about what Paul is talking about, even higher than Moses and Elijah, prophets and the law, this type of experience. So that's the first thing. You have to understand how highly he thought of this experience. Now, the other thing that he does is he compares the ministry that's been given to him that he has to do towards the Gentiles. He compares it to Moses and Elijah quite directly. So Paul, in fact, discusses the Mount Sinai revelations of Moses and Elijah. This is interesting that he's taking that up, right? In 2 Corinthians 3 and Romans 11:2. He draws specific parallels between the message and mission he received and the roles of Moses and Elijah in their own times. The Gospel of Mark reports the extraordinary meeting between Jesus, Moses, and Elijah in the Transfiguration. Paul, in some way, parallels his own revelatory experiences with that of Moses and Elijah. And he's quite specific about this point in 2 Corinthians 3. Moses saw the glory of God on Mount Sinai, right? So he had this amazing experience. We're not sure what exactly, but there he received the revelation of the Torah. But Paul likewise believed that he saw the glory of God in paradise, right? In the face of Christ this time possibly, and received by revelation what he calls the law, or directly translated, the Torah of Christ. And so he becomes, in some sense, an administrator of the new covenant with the new spiritual Israel. Now in 2 Corinthians 3, that's 2 Corinthians 3. The contrast in this portion is actually quite sobering if you read it from this perspective. Dispensation of death, he calls Moses and his revelation, but he calls his own dispensation one of the Spirit. He speaks of Moses' glory as one that fades away versus what he's experiencing as something that's a greater glory, a surpassing splendor. And God hardens the heart of those who hear Moses so they can't see the splendor of God. So already you have Paul putting himself almost against, or as opposed to the Jews, and their revelation is great, but there's something greater now, and he's the one who has it, right? This is what's going on here. Consider for a moment how utterly alien this idea would have been to Jews. How utterly alien this idea would be to the general Jew and the apostles. Because they were just basically Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. But now there's a guy in town who's saying that he had greater revelations than Moses and Elijah. What's going on here? Paul links the Spirit of Christ to the glory of Christ and the ongoing transformation of those who are in Christ from one degree of glory to another degree of glory. Paul's gospel is the revelation of the hidden mystery that God is creating a family of glorified spirits, which Paul calls sons. This necessitates a new covenant, a new Torah of Christ, and a newly formed people, which seems not to be defined by flesh or by circumcision, but defined by the Spirit of God. Now, that's for Moses. When it comes to Elijah, Elijah's revelation at the mountain came obviously quite a bit later. The nation of Israel had turned to idolatry during the reign of Ahab, and Elijah was discouraged, right? He was thinking that he was the only one that truly worshipped God that was left in Israel. But in 1 Kings 19, that's in 1 Kings 19, sorry. So Paul quotes Elijah's complaint specifically, and draws parallels to his own gospel message. He says, "So too, at this present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace." So what about the great majority of Jews who had not turned to Christ and the promises to them? According to Paul, God has not rejected the Jewish people, but based on Elijah's story, the great majority of Israel, according to the flesh, have been broken off like unfruitful branches because of their unbelief in Christ. This is Romans 11:1. Their hearts have been purposely hardened, branches that can be grafted in again, but through faith in Christ. Romans 11. Thus, therefore, is thus left only a remnant that God has chosen by grace, a small group of people, right, who have been united with Christ through his Spirit, baptism, communion, etc., irrespective of physical degree, whether they are Jewish, not circumcised or not. Once again, Jews would have taken great exception here to Paul's view, as he basically recontextualizes both of their great prophets. Paul's use of the term new covenant or renewed covenant implied a repudiation of the old covenant. I know there's some scholars will dispute this, some great scholars that I really revere. Paula Fredrickson would probably not agree with James on this. But anyway, let's stick with what James is saying. And I think most charismatic Christians, though, would agree with James on this, that the new covenant supersedes the old, and the old is passing away, because they would read Hebrews, of course. But this was not how Jews understood Jeremiah 31 to 37, which is what Paul is referring to here. According to Jews, Jeremiah envisions a renewal of the Torah of Moses with the reconstitution of the nation of Israel when all the tribes return to the land of Israel in the Messianic age. It's also this idea that we found, unlike Paul's, we find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We also find it in the Q source, where Jesus says that in the new age there will be thrones, and his disciples will sit on these 12 thrones ruling the tribes of Israel. So Jesus had a very pragmatic view of the future, where the disciples would be the rulers of the actual 12 tribes of Israel, which would be a miracle, of course, because 10 tribes have been long gone. Paul doesn't envision things like that. The Gentiles would not replace Israel for the Jews, but would have a place in partnership with Israel. God's house would be a house of prayer for all nations. What exactly Paul experienced in Arabia, we don't know, but the connotations with Moses and Elijah in Arabia seems to be too direct to ignore. And it seems like he sees himself as a new Moses or a new Elijah. He receives the revelation of the Torah of Christ and the hidden mystery of a new nation in the Spirit, which is a family of God. But this has to start with a remnant, according to Paul, until in the last days, until all is fulfilled. Paul believes that he was chosen from before, or from birth, or from before his birth. All right, let's step it up. All right, I see my battery is going flat, so if you see me poking the screen, it's me undoing the low battery indication. Now, Paul sees himself as an apostle to the Gentiles. Now, it's well known and understood that Jesus was called and lived out his ministry to the Jews almost exclusively, right? The apostles that came after him continued with the mission to the Jews. But it's Paul's who will fulfill the call to the Gentiles that will culminate in the return of Christ. In other words, Jesus can't return until Paul does his job, the job that the other apostles can't do. He does not confer with flesh and blood. He doesn't go to these guys to find out if he's on the right track, because he gets instructed straight from the risen Jesus. Galatians 1:15, 16, 25. When Paul did not get his audience with the Jerusalem leaders, when Paul eventually did get his audience with the Jerusalem leaders, he only was entrusted with this mission, the gospel to the Gentiles. Now, in his mind, this was the most important thing. This was the thing that was holding back Jesus. This was the thing without which, if this is not fulfilled properly, Jesus can't come back. It's the second stage of the salvation plan, if you like. First to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. First to the Jews was Jesus and his apostles. To the Gentiles, that's Paul's mission. Stage 1 is fulfilled by Jesus. Under the law, to redeem those under the law. But stage 2 was left at the feet of Paul. Romans 15, 8-9 states that Christ became a servant to the circumcised. Very interesting words by Paul here. So that the Gentiles might be glorified. So that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. It's a very interesting declaration, because Paul here is responsible for the ultimate plan of God, the Gentiles, that portion of it. Here Paul finds his unique and pivotal role in the whole story, salvation story. The whole thing now depends on him. Paul thinks of himself in terms of a priest that's bringing the offering of the Gentiles before God. That's the kind of metaphorical words he uses for this in Romans 15:16-18. He will not boast of anything, but that Christ is working through him. Now, I know me and you use this all the time. Christ is working through us. When I do this, when I give, when I bless someone, Christ is working through me. Okay, hold on. Paul, that's not what's written here. Paul believes that Christ was working through him. He doesn't say Christ is working through everyone in this portion. He's talking about himself, right? It also means that his commands were the commands of the Lord. This is a little bit frightening to me because whenever you have someone thinks that they speak on behalf of God all the time, you have possibility for a great cult. But this is how Paul saw himself. 1 Corinthians 14:37. It is possible that Paul thought that his ministry to the Gentiles was possibly foreshadowed in the Hebrew prophets, because the Hebrew prophets have several portions where it says that the Gentiles must come, and this was his mission, right? Who else? It's his mission. It's not the other apostles. He's the one responsible for this. So in other words, those scriptures must be prophesying about what he is about to do. Now, if that goes to your head, you have a problem. There's several passages that speak about the Gentiles returning to the Lord. Question mark. Did Paul think that he was speaking about him? Notice that these lines in particular from one of Isaiah's passages about a servant of Yahweh who will serve as an agent to bring light to the Gentiles sounds like what Paul is actually doing. Isaiah 49:1-6. Listen to me, you coastlands, and listen to me, you Gentiles. After a long time it'll happen. From my mother's womb he has called me, something which Paul believed about himself. He has made my mouth a sharp sword, something which Paul was quite proud of, that that he had the word, right? He had the gospel. And he has hidden me under the shadow of his hand. He has made me a chosen shaft. Lastly, behold, I have given you for the covenant of a race, for a light to the Gentiles, that you should be for salvation to the end of the earth. This kind of prophecy would fit very well to Paul's mission. He quotes this passage directly in 2 Corinthians 6:4-9. This passage of Isaiah 41, verse 1-2, in justifying his own special ministry. Now, I know we do this today. Christians read any portion of the Bible and just applies it to themselves and to other people. They use the Bible to condemn others. They use the Bible to find purpose for themselves all the time. And I think the reason we do that is probably because Paul did that. But it doesn't mean that Paul intended that for all. Firstly and essentially, when he was pulling these Old Testament things, he was talking about himself, right? Paul expected his ministry to go to the Gentiles, to make some of the non-believing Jews jealous, which will spark their conversation. He believed that all Israel will be saved, Romans 11:25. But this will happen because his ministry will bring in so many Gentiles. The glory would so be beautiful and surpassing that the Jews will be jealous and they will come and also be saved. Even the salvation of all Israel was depending on his success of his mission to the Gentiles. It's a lot of pressure to put upon yourself. Paul saw his suffering as some kind of extension of the redemptive suffering of Christ. For I bear on my body the wounds of Jesus. I know you've read that many, many times, but read this in this context. I bear in my body the wounds of Christ. He's not talking about you and me. He's talking about himself and what he is going through. Galatians 6:17. This is a testimony to his special and unique apostolic role, at least in his own mind. 2 Corinthians 11:23-25. So when Paul's work began in Asia Minor and Greece in the early 50s, he fully expected to live to see the return of Christ at the end of the age. We who are alive, he says in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. But by 60 CE, 10 years later, when he was imprisoned in Rome, he began to anticipate that he might have to die. But he doesn't just put it in terms of, I have to die. He kind of anticipates that his own life, like the life of Jesus, would be poured out as a libation upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. Right. This means that Paul sees himself as an offering that God is in some sense offering so that they can receive faith and can become faithful. Now, this is exactly what happened to Jesus. And if you just read it for what it says, it seems like Paul thinks of himself in certain terms, like he's not just a servant, someone that just, also just a Christian. He is a chosen person that also has to suffer so that others can live, in the same way that Jesus had to suffer so others could live. So the point is that when you read Paul from this perspective, you realize that Paul thought a lot about his own ministry and his own suffering and his own visions and his own gospel. Later in the book of Philippians, he starts anticipating that he was going to die, but then this is very controversial, but just listen to this. It seems like he was expecting that possibly he would also be resurrected. Now, not the general resurrection at the end of time, at the end of the age, which Paul believed in, Jesus believed in. But this passage here seems like Paul, of course, he's speaking about himself once again, possibly hoped that because he was so special and he was called from birth and he had such a pivotal role to play in the return of Christ and giving his life as an offering for the Gentiles to come in, therefore, so the Jews can come in, therefore, so Christ could return, that he thought that maybe he'd get a special permission at his death. Listen to this. For this sake, I have suffered the loss of all things, that I might know him and the power of his resurrection. So is this a final resurrection that he's talking about? And may share his sufferings, become like him in his death, that if possible I may attain being raised up out from among the dead. Now, two things here for me. Number one, if possible, it was a foregone conclusion that the dead would be resurrected. That's something Paul believed in, right? What is he talking about here? It seems like, and this is what James Tabor puts on the table, it seems like Paul here believes that because of his role, his pivotal role, and his amazing revelations and ascensions, that when he died, he would also be resurrected because he suffered like Jesus suffered, he would die like Jesus died, and he's going to be resurrected like Jesus was resurrected. So here James puts on the table, he says, look, maybe Paul had some delusions of grandeur at this point, which he thought that his death would be different from everybody else's death. Everybody else would have to die and wait for the general resurrection. But Paul believed that when he died, he would be resurrected like Jesus was resurrected. We take this normally as a generic statement, true for all in Christ. But here he is speaking specifically of his own imminent death. That's the context, which he calls departing to be with Christ. In other places, he also compares his own state of suffering for the sake of his followers with that of Jesus. 2 Corinthians 4:10-12. It is in this context that he speaks of being absent from the body and present with the Lord. Right? So a lot of people use this to say, no, Paul believes when you die, you go to heaven. No. This was a special exemption for Paul because of the role he played, that he wouldn't have to wait for the final resurrection, but he would experience what Jesus experienced, an immediate resurrection. So these passages seem to refer to Paul alone in his very special capacity. Paul speaks of the dead in Christ as those who had fallen asleep, in keeping with the Hebrew view that the dead who sleep in the dust will eventually be resurrected at the end. This is in 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, same as we find in the apocalyptic Daniel 12. They do not depart and be with Christ. That's not what the resurrection is about. That's not how it works. They die and they rise from the dead to meet him at his coming in new glorified bodies. 1 Thessalonians 4:16b to 17. Now, Albert Schweitzer, which is the OG of historical Jesus, he already suggested back then that Paul had come to believe in his later years that he would not live to see the return of Christ, fair, but that he would receive a special reward like Jesus upon his death, an immediate, special resurrection to be joined with Jesus, or to be joined with Christ, possibly as part of the revelation of the third heaven he received earlier. Maybe that's one of the things he was promised in his vision. We have no record of Paul's last years. We have to assume that he was executed by Nero in perhaps 64 CE in Rome, according to tradition. Our last authentic letters are likely written while he was captive in Rome between 62 and 64 CE. Considering Paul's understanding of his unique and pivotal role in ministry, or pivotal ministry and calling, we now have to turn to his actual message, which was a revelation of Christ. This whole section was to show that Paul, although last, he didn't think of himself as least. At worst, he thought of himself as like one second to Christ. And at best, he thought of himself as one above everybody else. Right. See you next time. Cheers.